The 1960s were the years of grime and glory for the steam railway, years in which steam locomotives fought a rearguard action against the ever-encroaching diesels and electrics. As government put the pressure on to reduce costs, wholesale closure loomed for many parts of the railway system. Enthusiasts followed the events with mounting concern, as BR forecast a future without steam. Special last runs and rail tours were organised. Preservation became the watchword, the everyday scene being preserved on film, whilst the infrastructure itself was to be the subject of ever-increasing schemes to preserve locomotives and complete railways. Richard Willis was involved in both spheres. As founder-chairman of the Mainline Steam Trust, he was heavily involved in the preservation of one of today's major railways, the Great Central. However, he also set out to preserve the everyday railway on 16mm film, tirelessly pursuing the working steam engine as it retreated to the ever-diminishing oases of steam. Our first oasis is the quiet country junction at Seaton, just inside Rutlandshire. Once a double junction with branches to Uppingham and Stamford, by the time of our visit in July 1963, the Ivet Class II motor-fitted tank worked only to Stamford on what was to become the very last push-and-pull steam service in the country when it finished in June 1966. At this time, the Uppingham branch still clung tenaciously to life as a goods-only branch, but it was to close a year later. We move on to the Midlands Stamford Town Station, where the Mickey Mouse terminated its train. The service formed a link between the Melton Mowbray to Peterborough line through Stamford and the Market Harborough to Peterborough line through Seaton. Cameo scenes such as this were soon to go. Water cranes disappeared from the railway scene as soon as steam was eliminated, as did motor trains. In the true heart of the Midland, Derby, was another oasis, the Great Northern Branch, which skirted the north and west sides of the city. Always known as the Friargate Line, Richard Willis travelled on the train, a month after his Seaton visit, headed by another product of Ivet and the LMS, a doodlebug. Richard's Jaguar XK150S stands by the ornate Friargate Bridge, which survives today, a monument to the line which closed in September 1964, the last train being headed by our train engine, 43160. Even the trolleybuses are history now. On the train we cross the Friargate Bridge and head northwest out of the city. 1960s housebacks set the tone. The city is home to Rolls-Royce as well as the famous Loco Works. We crossed the Midland Main Line on a 4-span plate girder bridge on the Skew, just before Bredsall Station, at which we didn't stop. The line had passed into the Midland region in 1950, and the Ivet Moguls appeared towards the end of its life in 1959, and saw it out to the end. Curiously, these were the product of the son of the Great Northern's H.A. Ivet. The line served the villages of the North Derbyshire collieries, and West Hallam was railhead for 2 collieries and an ironworks during its lifetime. This was the principal intermediate station on this part of the Derbyshire extension, as the railway was known, and the only one west of Ilkeston to boast a footbridge. The line was completed throughout in 1878, and as a second comer to the area, was unable to use the flatland of the Derwent Valley. As a result, it ran across the grain of the land, cutting through the tops of hills and striding over the valleys. Before Ilkeston, the main feeder branches ran off north and south at Stanton Junction, to Peena and Stanton Ironworks, respectively. Even at this late date, evidence of the mineral traffic is seen as we approach Ilkeston. The principal civil engineering feature of the line was the massive 16-span lattice steel viaduct over the Owash Valley and the Midlands Main Line. The speed restriction was imposed on the structure, but it survives today. Our next stop is on the east side of the Owash Valley and precedes the junction with the Great Northern Branch to Pinxton. The complex nature of the line is illustrated by the massive limestone cutting and short tunnel at Watnall. Basford and Bulwell Station was built high above the Midlands Nottingham to Mansfield line and the complex coal sidings. By 1963, trains off the Friargate line ran direct into Nottingham, Victoria, shared with Great Central, Richard Willis's home and favourite line. And it's on Richard's favourite line that we see our first mainline train, Black 5 crossing the River Soar at Frog Island, half a mile north of Leicester, in the early dawn of a January 1964 day. And a little later, a B1 heads southwards on the same day, in the same place. By contrast, another Black 5 enjoys the glorious weather of a sunny May morning as it also heads south with the Nottingham to Marylebone semi-fast, a train which will barely last another 2 years. Now we join the spotters at Richard's favourite location of all, the foot crossing at his local station, Belgrave and Burstall. In July 1963, BR Standard 73045 races north, followed by that classic of Great Central steam, a 9F on a mixed freight. Another Great Central classic is the island platform layout, illustrated here at Belgrave and Burstall, now the northern terminus of the restored Great Central Railway. We looked south towards Leicester in March 1963. We returned to the outskirts of Leicester in June to view 92072 on a freight at Abbey Lane allotments. Note this engine's large BR1F tender. To the south, Charwelton is the venue for a B1 hauled express. The 61144 heads north past the interchange sidings for the local ironstone system. Another ironstone complex follows at Croxton, where we see Ajax shunting the quarry line on the occasion of an enthusiast breakvan special in September 1967. Croxton was located in northeast Leicestershire, and the quarry line connected with BR on the East Coast Main Line near Burton Coggles. This breakvan tour was locally organised and included the Reverend Teddy Boston amongst its participants, and no doubt organisers. These scenes were recorded at the quarry end of the line. The line achieved local fame for a while as the base for Pendennis Castle before she was exiled to Australia. In Leicester itself, a fireless 040 tank is seen shunting the gasworks sidings on Ayleston Road overbridge on a May morning, and then, a month earlier, we see a B1 heading east on the Great Northern Line out of the city, as cars, buses and bikes set the year as 1964 at Humberstone. Humberston is also the setting for a B1 hauled freight. The 61004 Oryx heads north, while sister 61028 heads south with a passenger, both, unusually, on the Midland Main Line. More appropriate, perhaps, is a Black 5, 45282, seen at Syston. These shots were taken in July 1964. Ominous signs abound at this major junction, as coaches lie derelict in the sidings, and the predecessor to the HSTs of today roars northwards, the Blue Pullman. Travelling eastwards from Syston, we come to the delightful Midland Country Station at Oakham, the prototype for many models. As the A30 Countryman draws to a stand, a BR Standard Class 4 460, number 75067, heads east with a mixed bag of coaches for Stamford. This line joins the East Coast Main Line at Peterborough, and we also head that way to Burton Coggles. The 6007 Sir Nigel Gresley streaked south in July 1963 with a rail tour. The East Coast Main Line only qualifies as an oasis of steam by virtue of the specials run over it, as by the mid-1960s, Deltics and Brush diesels dominated the route. Britannia 70020 Mercury is seen heading south with the Home Counties Railway Society special in October 1964. The same engine is also seen at Yaxley, south of Peterborough. Perhaps the most unusual visitor to the East Coast Main Line was this engine, Clun Castle. Pat Whitehouse's Great Western 460 was much travelled in the 1960s, and here we see her at Peterborough's New England shed in September 1967 on the occasion of an Ian Allen rail tour, which was one of a number of tours made at that time. By this time, New England had no steam allocation, so the facilities were somewhat run down, and the whole area, once one of the busiest steam depots on the East Coast, wore an air of dereliction and abandonment. The castle's visit was interesting, as it recalled the famous 1925 trials in which Pendennis Castle ran on the East Coast Main Line in exchange for Gresley's Victor Wilde, after the Great Western proudly displayed the first engine of the cast alongside Flying Scotsman at the Wembley exhibition that year. They boasted that it was the most powerful locomotive in Great Britain, and so Gresley effectively challenged Collet to prove it. The castle worked over the Great Northern Main Line, astonishing the owners of the massive Gresley Pacifics with its capabilities. It's a matter of record how Gresley subsequently modified the A1s in the light of experience. Collet had certainly proven it. We next see Clun Castle as she leaves Peterborough to the north at Warrington. Next is Newark, on another Ian Allen tour. Without a headboard, the castle dives into Peascliff Tunnel near Belton, some 2.5 miles north of Grantham. finally we have two views of the engine on yet another Ian Allen rail tour on the ECML, this time on the 8th of October 1967, firstly seen near Claypole and then running through Doncaster. A week later, she was to run over the Settle and Carlisle. We go in the opposite direction, what was perhaps the oasis of steam from 1964 to 1967, the Bournemouth Main Line. Here, the great advocate of electric traction, the Southern, had seen to it that steam should reign supreme right to the end, earning the Wessex Main Line the title of the last steam main line. Bulleid's Pacifics in their rebuilt form dominated the scene, but we start at Weybridge in February 1964, when Richard Willis, together with a second cameraman, visited the station to record this BR standard on an up parcels, followed swiftly by Belgian Marine on the Bournemouth Bell. For most of the time, the second cameraman, seen here with Richard's spare camera, was positioned on the up platform, thus obtaining alternative views of trains which we saw in volumes 2 and 3. Discs at the top and bottom of the smokebox indicate an Exeter or Salisbury Express, whilst one on the end of the buffer beam and on the opposite side of the smokebox denote a Bournemouth train. This is the last Merchant Navy, Elder Dempster Lines. We saw this standard class 4 in volume 3 in close-up, as Richard was on the down platform. We'll see him in action as the next engine, a light mogul, passes by. Further along the main line, we see an unrebuilt Pacific, followed by a rebuilt example at Purbright Junction. Morning light, an eastbound Bournemouth Express runs along the unelectrified Up Main, the two outer local lines being energised for the Farnham and Alton route, which diverged here. This is an Up Exeter, to be followed by two Bournemouth trains. Further west, none of the lines are electrified, although the main line is 4-track as far as Worthing Junction, to the west of Basingstoke. Milk trains are important on the Southern. Here a standard 460 heads west with 6-wheeled tanks. The standards took turn and turnabout with the Bulleids on all kinds of trains, even to the top link expresses. Rebuilding of the Pacifics had begun in 1956, with 90 out of the 140 being dealt with. The originals were the first to go, so they were quite rare to film from 1964 onwards. Number 34024 Tamar Valley has an interesting collection of parcel stock behind her as she heads for Bournemouth. Perhaps equally interesting is the Down Exeter Express behind now preserved Battle of Britain 257 Squadron. This is 35022 Holland America line at Bisley. The famous Battledown flyover heralds the parting of the ways between the Exeter and Bournemouth routes. A second camera shot shows an up Southampton semi-fast behind BR Class 5, number 73065. Under the flyover itself comes a special behind 35023 Holland Africa line, another second camera shot. The next two shots show Bournemouth trains with rebuilt bullies, the first making heavy weather of a down train of vans. Now the reason for filming here becomes apparent, as we see A4 Kingfisher returning east with a rail tour off the Salisbury and Exeter line, which also dates these sequences as April 1966. The A4 wasn't the only visitor to the Southern, and here we see Britannia Class Pacific number 70020 Mercury once again at Overton, the second station westbound from Battledown on the Salisbury Road. She's seen once more further west on the same tour. Note the narrow profile restriction 0 Maunsell coach at the rear. Hinton Admiral is the third of three identical stations on the Bournemouth direct line through the New Forest. Sway and Hinton Admiral boasted the luxury of Pullman camping coaches during the 1950s and 60s. Sadly, they were scrapped on site in 1967. The 2-mile-long Christchurch Bank was a final racing ground for westbound Pacifics with Bournemouth Expresses, but they were restricted from making a rush up Folkestone Bank on the other side of the town by a 60 mph restriction over the River Avon Bridge at the foot of the bank. Once again we're visiting the Southern to see an A4, this time the preserved Sir Nigel Gresley in 1967. From the east on the Southern, we go from west to northwest, commencing on the Great Western Main Line at Aldermaston, to watch another long-gone feature of the steam railway, picking up water at speed from troughs, as a hall passes by at the head of Southern Green Stock. On the south to northwest route, we see more Southern Green Stock on the western region, as a Class 5 brings a cross-country train into Oxford Station, which was featured heavily in Volume 2. Class 5 waters, we move smartly westwards to mid-Wales in January 1965 to see Bradley Manor at speed on an SLS rail tour, and then over to Chester Station to witness the arrival of the Great Marquis on another tour in May 1964. On this occasion, the second cameraman was on the other side of the tracks. Note the bell on the front of the engine. In her second incarnation today, this is no longer carried. This scene could almost be repeated today. The steam regularly runs on the North Wales Coast route through Chester, and the K4 Mogul is again passed for mainline running. However, the 1960s fashions are gone for good, and Chester has lost its water cranes and semaphore signalling, and, of course, the magnificent London North Western signal boxes and line-side paraphernalia. We now move to the northwest, dominated by the North Western. This was the final oasis of steam of all. Steam was to die in this corner of the railway world in 1968. However, in the mid-60s, the Loon Gorge still echoed to the two-cylinder beat of Black Fives and the three-cylinder beat of Royal Scots and Jubilees, both passenger and freight duties. This Scot is heading south with oil tanks. Note the barrier wagons at front and rear. The Jubilee which follows has a very small payload. However, it contrives to carry both first and second class passengers as well as perishables. Another Jubilee forges steadily uphill north of Tebay in May 1964. But it does have help. We move on to that favourite 1960s location, Scout Green, for a banked freight. The next train has two locomotives. The Pilot turning out to be the rarest of them all, 44767, the unique Stephenson valve-geared machine, later to be preserved. The train engine is one of the later Britannias, 70034, once Thomas Hardy. .44675 follows on a down fish train, its speed being accounted for by an almost invisible banker. This is a second camera shot of a northbound express headed by 45336. From the other side of the line, we view a lone 264 tank, number 42414, heading uphill. Also alone, in the sense of not having a banker, is Britannia 70030, William Wordsworth, still bearing its name. spectacular exhaust announces an unusual opportunity to view a former crusty-fitted 9F on a passenger working as we leave the West Coast Main Line. We move on to Scotland, to Octorada on the Stirling to Perth Main Line to view a BR Class 5 and an A4 on down expresses. This was of course the famous Indian summer of the A4s, set to work the Glasgow to Aberdeen 3-hour trains. This is number 9 in September 1965. We now cross to Larbert, between Falkirk and Stirling, to witness the second cameraman's second view of Union of South Africa running through non-stop. She is followed by number 31 Golden Plover, on a northbound train which called here briefly, with just enough time to run up the platform to record the departure, shown here in full. Everywhere there was evidence of change. Blue Electrics at Stockport Edgeley presided over the elimination of steam. Manchester to Crewe was the first part of the West Coast Main Line to go over to electric traction. But even these early machines were destined for replacement. Note the double pantographs. This was a Class 81, already nearly 4 years old in August 1963. However, we've come to see steam engines, even those in store or ready for scrapping, from this crab to a rather sorrowful Black 5, but everyday maintenance must go on. Preferable by far is a live engine, and we see the already legendary double-chimneyed Jubilee Bahamas as she leaves the deserted shed and goes on to her train. Another Jubilee is Alberta, presenting an almost immaculate appearance in what appears to be an unlined green livery. She's at Normanton on the Midland outside Wakefield in October 1967. She was one of the celebrated Leeds Jubilees which saw out express power on the Settle and Carlisle, and is preparing to take over a rail tour from Oliver Cromwell, the equally celebrated but ultimately luckier Britannia. The diagonal stripe through 45562's cabside number denotes her ban from under the wires south of Crewe. Note, from this side, she is fully lined out. We see Oliver Cromwell once again, running light after a further leg of the same rail tour. This engine was the last Britannia to be shopped, and she became the BR flagship in the northwest in the final months of steam, eventually replacing Britannia herself as the official National Collection representative of British Railways' first standard class of locomotive. These shots were recorded at Guide Bridge, on the former Great Central Main Manchester to Sheffield route, hence the wires. Also at Guide Bridge, this time a month later, in November 1967, is Bittern, at that time one of the mainline A4s, preserved but still usable. How sad that today she is non-operational. We see her owner, Jeff Drury, on the footplate as she buffers up to the rear of her rail tour stock before shunting it away. In September 1966, while still in BR ownership, 60019 is seen entering that cathedral of East Coast steam, York Station, on one of her most popular rail tours. In the background is York Loco Shed, destined to become the National Railway Museum. As one of the last three A4s in Scotland, Bittern was a popular rail tour engine, being brought down at weekends especially for these duties. And so we come to the end, 1968. The final oasis of steam was the North West. Black Fives at Manchester Central and Manchester Victoria give us a brief reminder of how it used to be. But these were just pale shadows of a glorious past. Now every steam journey was to be savoured, and rail tours gave many their last opportunities to travel behind favourite motive power. Richard Willis enjoyed a tour behind 70013, Oliver Cromwell, seen backing onto her stock at Victoria Station. In this last summer of steam, the stock had a patchwork appearance, as the new blue and grey corporate livery gained ground. At 10:30 precisely, we're off. Note the 1960s fashions. The end of steam was at the height of the swinging 60s. The route was westbound out of Manchester to Bolton, along Lancashire and Yorkshire metals, and then via Soft Tunnel to Blackburn. Rows of disused 8Fs, Black 5s and a solitary Class 4 mogul stood in mute testament to the end of steam, seen echoed throughout the northwest of famous sheds such as Rose Grove, Lostock Hall and Carnforth. These were the classes which would, together with a few standards, bring the curtain down on BR steam. Another of the features of the steam railway, signal boxes at every conceivable location, have now gone, and Blackburn, our present destination, although it still sees steam, is a ghost of its 1968 presence. And so to the last rites. Carnforth, Black 5 number 45156, brings in a rail tour organised by the Bahamas Preservation Group, at that time based at Stockport, as the mourners gather in August 1968. Considerable efforts were made even in these times to clean up the engines, and 45156 presented a very creditable appearance. Although no longer bearing nameplates, this had been one of the very exclusive band of four, and for a short while 5, named Black Fives, having borne the name Ayrshire Yeomanry for most of her working life. We see the second cameraman once again, as the time-honoured ritual of talking to the driver occurs one last time, before the engine sets off with the stock before going on shed. Carnforth shed at this time was still a working loco depot, although arrangements had already been made to secure its future as the Steamtown Museum. Backing down past a Class 25 diesel is 453.90, due to work the last train of all, the 15 guineas special. 75046 and 44709 head a lineup of dead locos on the north side of the shed as final cops are recorded. This tender will see no further use. Once again, 45390 sets back, this time to collect the second engine for the final rail tour, 45025, a locomotive destined for preservation in Scotland on the Strathspey Railway. From the footbridge at the northwestern end of Carnforth's Barrow and Furness Line platforms, we see the two black fives back down to the holding siding to await the arrival of their train. Note the different arrangements of top feeds on these two apparently identical black fives. In the now preserved shed, onlookers look across a soon-to-be-scrapped Clayton diesel as the end draws ever closer. Richard Willis didn't follow the train any further. The back of it summed it all up. And so it seemed to enthusiasts everywhere. BR imposed a steam ban as soon as the last train had run, with only Flying Scotsmen able to run on BR metals due to a watertight contract. So mainline steam locomotives, such as Cluncastle and Colliper, seemed destined to ride up and down on lines measured in hundreds of yards rather than hundreds of miles. But some far-sighted people foresaw a time when BR would relent and ensured that steam would still have mainline sheds, so at Carnforth, Stockport, Didcot, and as seen here Tyseley, sheds were saved to provide strategic locations for the mainline steam of the future. Some idea of the scale of the early preservation projects and the enormous interest they generated can be seen at Tyseley's open day on the 29th of September 1968. Not only were the two mainline 460 on show, but a breakdown crane gave lifting demonstrations outside the yet-to-be-demolished roundhouse, and locomotives destined to go to other railways, and even a Class 50 diesel from BR, mixed with fairground sideshows. The other main strand of preservation was the burgeoning preserved railway industry, and what was to become self-billed as Britain's premier steam railway is our next stop, as we celebrate the Severn Valley Railway's Bridge North Steam Gala on the 20th of April 1968, 4 months before steam was to end on BR. Once again, the crowds bear testament to the great pulling power of steam. time of its opening, Severn Valley operated on only the short northern section between Bridgnorth and Hampton Load, and for the gala was able to produce 2 locos. Note the non-corridor coaches behind the Collick goods. Today, 8-coach corridor sets are the rule. The second engine was the small Ivet Mogul 46443, which is seen coming onto the head shunt and then carrying a Midlander headboard running round at the temporary terminus at Hampton Load. Back at Bridgnorth, we again witnessed the departure of the Collet 060 3205. This engine was to depart from the railway altogether in the 1980s for West Somerset. As mentioned at the beginning of this programme, Richard Willis was instrumental in the rescue of his own local and favourite railway, the Great Central. Today, the sole remaining Great Central Express engine is still able to run across Swithlin Reservoir, and the railway is looking forward to an even greater future with the reinstatement of double track over much of its length. Today the Great Central is but one of many oases of steam, and steam activity on BR main lines seems to be getting greater every year. The gloom is gone, railway preservation has kept the steam engine alive and well with a glorious future. So we end with a reprise of some of Richard Willis's favourite engines at work in the 60s, a reminder of how it really was.